So, tonight I'm going to be giving a talk on grand strategy games, and specifically something I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is what I'm calling the paradox of power in grand strategy games. Um, so, I'm going to open up with a quote that explains the title a little better, and just sort of pocket it and keep it in mind while we're doing the talk, which is, appropriately enough, a quote from Napoleon: "Victory belongs to the most persevering." Just keep that in mind as we go through. Just sort of where they come from. So strategy games go back. You could even call chess, as well as other traditional board games, strategy games if you wanted. Um, but the first place that I really see like grand strategy games that are trying to actually simulate geopolitical stuff is actually in military simulations. So Kriegspiel, which is, I've actually misspelled it, but Kriegspiel was done in the Prussian officer corps starting in the 1800s, and it is exactly what we would recognize as a war game. You sit at a table, there are little models of military units, you have two competing sides, and you actually have what we would call a game master. They called it like a neutral observing party because they're Germans, so they like big complicated phrases. But we would just call it a game master. They were neutral and they managed the rules. And eventually, in the early 20th century, this developed into its own sort of recreational tradition of strategy board games. One of the most famous is Diplomacy, which is set in Europe, and it's basically you negotiate with other players and try to work out who you can trust in the maneuvering and placement of your armies. And then starting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when you start getting a real strong nerd culture and a geek culture that's sort of centered around strategy games like this, you get games like Axis and Allies, which you can see a photo of a modern version up on the top there. I cannot describe to you how involved Axis and Allies is. It's basically Risk on steroids. And of course, once computer gaming starts coming around, when you start having personal home computers in the 80s, people quickly realized that you could use a computer to automate the difficult tasks of running the rule set of the game that was previously so time intensive. So the first real grand strategy game on computer in 85 and then for Windows in 86 is Balance of Power, which is a Cold War simulation game. And it fits all the definitions of a grand strategy game. You manage resources, you have to deal with diplomacy, it occurs over a long period of time, and it's not like reflex based. It's really the first grand strategy game, and things just kind of develop from there. Paradox Game Studios starts up in the late 90s. That's around when the Total War series kicks off. Civilization has been going since the early 90s, and these are the three games that we're going to be referencing the most in this talk. But since we've talked about where they've come from, let's talk a little bit about what they actually are. So my working definition is that a grand strategy game is one in which you have a unified set of resources and actors that are under your control, which we would call like a faction. So that's like your empire. If you're playing as England, you control all the English units and you have access to all the English resources. That is your unified set that you're in control of. And you're playing on a consistent space, which we would call a map. So it might be a map of Europe, it might be a map of just like a localized area like England, it could be a map of the entire world, it can be a randomly generated map like in Civ, but you have a consistent space and you're controlling a faction. The second point is kind of weirdly articulated. That space affects the resources and the actors. So basically what you have is that where you are on the map, it has different properties spatially, as well as with regards to resources. So Spain, for instance, could be a province in your game, and it would have a certain amount of gold per turn that you earn. Let's just simplify it. Spain gives you 6 gold per turn. If you also control Portugal, you get an additional 4 gold per turn, let's say. So what spaces you control on the map can affect things like, how well your units do, what kind of resources you have, specific bonuses. Civ 5 players, you would know like luxury resources, stuff like that. But there are other factions on the map that you can interact with, not necessarily just in an aggressive action, but you can also cooperate with them. But yeah, and the fourth point, you're competing in space and resources but you can also, it got cut off, but you can also compete as well and cooperate. So there's a complicated diplomacy that's going on. It's not just us versus them. So yeah, in non-robot speech, you control a nation or an empire, usually, and you're trying to beat the other nations on the map, both economically and militarily, and those often go hand in hand. And you can engage in diplomacy with them. So some examples of that in Civ 5, which takes place over the entire course of human history, you can become friends with another civilization that is in the game. And then you guys will theoretically be buddies and then gang up on other people. Or you can say, hey, I really don't like, I don't know why I'm picking Spain so much tonight. I really don't like Spain. Hey, Attila, what say you and I go to war with Spain? That sounds great. Let's take all their cattle. You can engage in complicated ideas more than just, I'm going to kill you, you're going to kill me. And then another thing that's important to note about GSGs is that they're usually set in historical periods and places. And this is for a really, really obvious reason, which is that it makes it really easy to understand what the significance of things might be. Victory conditions in grand strategy games. I've divided them up into 3 different sort of categories, and I couldn't really think of any exceptions in the game to these victory conditions. Straight up points. Points are like the oldest form of scoring victory conditions in video games, and whether it's Super Mario or whether you're playing like Dota or you're playing grand strategy games. I don't know about Dota so much. Maybe there are other games that have point systems. Points are a common thing in games. I think we can all agree. So sometimes you'll have like specific different kinds of points. Like Crusader Kings 2 uses prestige points, which is funnily enough the same thing that Balance of Power use. They use prestige points as well as not being nuked. Good old-fashioned world conquest, which is the most traditional thing to do in grand strategy games. You beat up everyone else, you rule the world. It's awesome. It's what you've always wanted to do in strategy games. Everyone like has fantasies about that. And then the other thing, which is starting to become a little bit more common, is you'll see specific win conditions. So this is usually a set of requirements you have to fulfill, and then doing that gives you a victory. Classic example that has done it this way for a lot of years is Civilization 5. So in Civilization 5, as well as the rest of the Civ series, you can win a world conquest victory, but you can also build a spaceship and go to Alpha Centauri, which is a science victory. Or you can be best friends with everyone and they vote you world leader, which is a diplomatic victory. Or you can become the most culturally influential Civ, which is basically building the most cultural buildings, but that's later. So these are the general kind of conditions. And the common theme you start to see here is that a lot of them are, about expanding or building up. It's all about it's about accruing power. And so that brings us to what I'm calling the paradox of power. And this is kind of my central thesis here. There is a problem in grand strategy games, which has been known for a long time, and a lot of different communities have different names for it, but I'm going to call it the paradox of power. So some of you might be familiar with the quote, which is actually in Civ 5, so this is kind of meta. I think Civ 4 actually, but happiness is the feeling that resistance is being overcome, which is a quote by this crazy Austrian guy who's no one's ever heard of. But yeah, the goal as well as the source of enjoyment in grand strategy games is overcoming resistance. You acquire more power. So it's a satisfying feeling to say, you know what, I'm so good, even though you have more resources than me, I can take you down. That feels really, really good. In Crusader Kings 2, one of the favorite ways to do that, those who don't know, Crusader Kings 2, you actually play as a family dynasty that's passed from generation to generation, but the same idea of trying to acquire territory applies, in essence. You can start as some count who owns a random province in the middle of Germany, And then you can become the Holy Roman Emperor of all of Germany in a couple generations. Your family works up. Rags to riches, it's a classic story. But the problem with this is that that same resource-based cycle you're trying to overcome also applies to you, because if it didn't, it wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fair if having more resources made the AI stronger and then didn't make you stronger. So once you get to a point, you become the big player to beat, and you don't have anyone else left to beat. Theoretically, you could, these are all games that are set in history. So how was this problem solved in history? How did the problem of power perpetuating power, how does that resolve itself in history? It's internal instability. Empires fall, a lot of times not because of challenges from without, or they are falling because of challenges from without, but also because that's compounded by internal problems. There's just one problem with doing that in strategy games. That is a lot harder to model than modeling competition with a foreign power. So let's say you want to do a game that's set during the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, how do you figure out modeling a mechanic that represents the separation of the Senate from the means of controlling the state? That's a really complicated, nuanced problem. You can't really model that in a gamified fashion. You can't say, I'm going to win a lot of battles, and then that gives me points, and I can use those points to buy the allegiance of senators, and that keeps them in Rome instead of retiring to their villas. It doesn't work as well. Internal stress is hard to model in strategy games. And then the third reason, if you had a grand strategy game that was legitimately you didn't know you were going to win until the very last second, that can be a lot of fun. It can also really be a huge bummer because these games take massive amounts of time. This is really more of a personal problem, but when you talk, when I talked at the beginning about victory through perseverance, a game of Civ 5 can take at least 5 hours. If you play on longer speed settings, it can take dozens. A total war campaign, you're looking at least 12 hours to get a full world conquest. And you Paradox games, you don't even want to know. It can take all weekend if you just marathon it, which I do not recommend. But the point is if you invest that certain amount of time in a game, it would be really, really frustrating to just get to the end and then you're doing well and then you just don't win. Random chance or some factor outside of your control, it's frustrating. So, for a certain reason, the paradox of power has to exist because there has to be a reward for your investment of time. So, just stopping again, I've done a lot of dry talking. Is everyone kind of on board with the idea of this paradox? It makes sense because it's an original thesis. And like I said, in different communities, this has a lot of different names. The Paradox Forums likes to call it blobbing, which is why France is called the Big Blue Blob, because they own, at the start, they own the largest territory in Europe, and they also have the richest territory in terms of manpower. And so that's a resource in game, is how many soldiers you have access to. So France will use that to just sort of steamroll all of Western Europe. It's really, really common in games of Europa Universalis 4 to have it by the mid-1600s. France owns the entire seaboard from Portugal up to Germany. It's really frustrating. They're the Big Blue Blob. In Civ, it's known as runaways. So you're minding your own business on your continent, you're doing whatever you need to do, you conquer a couple people, that makes you stronger, and then eventually you own the entire continent, nothing can stand up to you. You're a runaway. And if you play on a difficulty setting where the AI is stronger than you are, the AI will do that on their own because they have bonuses and stuff. So can it be overcome mechanically? So we talked a little bit about internal instability, and one game that tries to actually model that really well is Crusader Kings 2. So in Crusader Kings 2, it's all modeled on a feudal system, so you have to make sure your vassals like you, otherwise they won't give you troops, they won't give you money, and they might revolt. So because you're playing as a specific individual and not an entire anonymous nation, it means that you could suddenly be playing as a character who's a really, really terrible diplomat, and no one likes you because you're an ugly cripple because it's the medieval period, and that happened. And then no one wants to give you troops, and then you have a civil war, and then no one likes you, so they don't raise troops, and then you get ousted, and then your empire kind of collapses a little bit. So in Crusader Kings 2, you can definitely have these cycles of expanding and falling as a family. However, it's still a game mechanic, and people are really, really good at figuring out how to work game mechanics. And so what happens is there are all these different subsystems in Crusader Kings 2. You can work your way around any of them. I have literally seen playthroughs where people start in like 600 AD as a Zoroastrian. I can't pronounce that. Zoroastrian? Zoroastrian. It's one of those words you read and don't say a lot. Start as a Zoroastrian in the middle of Persia in like 8600, and you're the only Zoroastrian in existence. And then in 300 years, they own all of the Middle East and parts of Europe. So, as much as that internal instability mechanic is there, you can still overcome it. Another example, which you can see on the top there, is in Shogun 2 Total War, which takes place exclusively in Japan and focuses on the Sengoku period of civil war there. They have realm divide. So basically what happens is you play as a local lord, you take over more territory. Once you own a certain amount of territory and everyone else is afraid of how much you're expanding, everyone will go to war with you at once, which is awful. And it just happens halfway through the game. People you've been allied with the entire game, who have been your best friends, they will just suddenly declare war on you because that is what happens. There was a lot of frustration with this feature because it's very artificial feeling. It doesn't really suit the narrative if you want to say that there is one in this game, because again, people that you've been friends with the entire time will just randomly backstab you. And then the other example of that, something similar, is coalitions and aggressive expansion in your EU4. So coalitions will form if you become too powerful and your neighbors don't like you, and that's basically a bunch of people agreeing to go to war with you if you go to war with any one of them, kind of like what happened to Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. And then there's also just a general aggressive expansion modifier. So if you expand too fast, like let's say you're playing as, you're playing as France, and then you all at once take all of Spain in one single war, everyone is really, really going to hate you, and that's going to affect your diplomacy with them, and they're going to be more likely to go to war with you. Again, the same problem is that these basically just function as artificial challenges. It's just another barrier of resistance for the gamer to overcome. And there are, again, people who have figured out really, really good ways to overcome this. And that's one of the more frustrating things that you hit on, is that sometimes these mechanics work, and sometimes you do get that rare grand strategy game where it is legitimately seat of your pants the entire way through. It's rare. That's really the feeling you're going for in a grand strategy game. But it's kind of bizarre that we only get that some of the time, that it's kind of an unexpected thing when that happens. And then general limitation mechanics. These just keep you from expanding too quickly. I guess aggressive expansion is one of those. Unhappiness in the Civ series is another. And then also just out of game, it's really micromanaging and annoying to be really powerful and large. We've talked about a couple different ways that you can solve this mechanically, or that you can try to solve this mechanically. But I kind of want to end with talking about my favorite resolution to this, and the one that I find the most interesting, which is solving the game by the way you play it. And this is actually something I think I've talked about a little bit before, in the idea of performing games a certain way. But that was really talking about performing games to be watched by other people. When I talk about solving the problem of the paradox of power in grand strategy games by the way you play it, it's recognizing that this is an inherent problem to the genre that is difficult to, if not impossible, to overcome mechanically, at least with the current way that we design grand strategy games. And you sort of recognize that, and you recognize that what you're going for is that sweet spot where you're overcoming resistance, and you incorporate that into the way you play the game. So basically, I guess a good analogy for this would be, everyone in here has played like some kind of role-playing game, right? Even like, you know, Pokemon, Skyrim, some kind of role-playing game. An analogy would be playing a Pokemon game where you do it like a Nuzlocke playthrough, where you know, release, whatever, you're euthanizing it, where you release your starting Pokemon and then just play with like the random Pidgey that you captured outside of the first town. It adds a whole another layer of challenge to the game and makes you think about it in ways you normally wouldn't, but gives you that higher, longer duration of resistance, which is more satisfying. Or like in Skyrim, you can decide to be a character who makes no sense, who is going to use just their fists, even though there isn't even a fist skill in Skyrim, and you aren't going to wear armor because you've decided your character doesn't like armor, and you are only going to heal yourself by eating cheese. That is perfectly legitimate within the mechanics. There are no mechanics that like directly support that. The game does not tell you to play the game like that. And it will be a lot harder, but it can be more satisfying. And so ways that you see this in grand strategy games, there are a lot of different ways that the community has come up with to do this. One of the popular ones in forums is to do monthly challenges, which I'm a big fan of. So this could be something like, let's see, what are some recent examples? On the Civ forums, one of the really popular challenges is you play only as a specific Civ, and then you have to complete extra arbitrary conditions. So you aren't allowed to do certain things. Like you aren't allowed to research a certain technology before another technology. Or you could do a playthrough where you aren't allowed to do diplomacy. You're playing as Attila of the Huns, and you are just going to declare war on every single person you see. Makes it massively more difficult, but again, it's about increasing that sweet spot where you're getting resistance. And then in Paradox games, another example of this, and actually this is my absolute favorite example, just because it really shows how much a video gaming community can contribute to video games. So like in Crusader Kings 2, they've extended out the timeline so you can play all the way from about 8600 to about AD or Common Era, like 1440. You get one person to start a game in 600, and they build up as much of an empire as they can in 100 years. You save the game, and then you pass it to another person who then has to compete against that player-made empire. So it basically becomes a succession challenge. So like, I united all of North Africa in 100 years. Now you start as someone in Spain, take that down in 100 years. And then they do that, and then maybe you expand out a little bit into Germany, and then you save that game and pass it along to the next person. And so by doing this, you're kind of passing this around and finding ways to overcome that paradox a little bit by making it consistently even and consistently difficult.